In a small corner store, a lonely CEO crosses paths with a young black girl, orphaned and living with her grandmother. In the store, the little girl boldly asks him to be her dad for just one day. Haunted by his own past, he agrees to join her for a school event. Whispers and judgment follow. People think he's putting on a show. But ignoring the noise, two broken souls find each other, begin to heal, and their lives are changed forever. Before we dive in this story, let us know where you're watching from. We love to hear your thoughts. It was one of those mornings in Harlem when the city never really woke up, it just rolled over and grumbled. The air was cold, heavy with the scent of fried food from the corner deli and exhaust from idling cars. People moved fast, collars up, eyes down, trying to outrun the cold and the weight of another Monday. Inside the corner convenience store on 126th and Lenox, fluorescent lights buzzed weakly overhead, casting a pale glow over shelves stocked with instant noodles, canned beans, and discounted toiletries. The line at the counter snaked all the way down the narrow aisle. At the front of that line stood Jonathan Reed, tall, crisp, every inch of him screamed Wall Street money and Manhattan control. His tailored charcoal overcoat, pressed navy suit. But life had a funny way of dragging you places you didn't expect. His sharp blue eyes flicked to his wristwatch, and his jaw tensed. 7 minutes behind schedule. Unacceptable. The young cashier, a wiry kid with dreadlocks barely out of high school, held up a bottle with a nervous smile. Sparkling water, right, sir? Jonathan's gaze dropped to the label. His expression didn't change, but the air seemed to cool by several degrees. He placed the bottle back on the counter with slow, deliberate precision. No. His voice was calm, low, the kind that didn't need volume to command attention. Still water. Not sparkling. The kid fumbled with the register, cheeks flushing red, eyes darting to the receipt. I thought... Jonathan cut him off, not unkindly, but like slicing paper with a ruler. You thought wrong, he said, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve with the elegance of a man who'd fired people for less. And now I'm late. His tone never rose, but his presence did all the shouting for him. Behind him, the line shifted with restless energy. A woman with 2 kids on her hip huffed. An older man in a faded Mets jacket muttered under his breath. But Jonathan didn't care. Then, slicing through the hum of quiet irritation came a voice. Small, high-pitched, startlingly clear like a bell cutting through fog. Mister, could you be my daddy, just for one day? The store went still. Heads turned. Even the cashier froze, receipt forgotten mid-print. Jonathan turned, slowly, with the controlled caution of a man accustomed to unpredictable boardrooms, but entirely unprepared for what he saw. Standing barely 3 feet away was a little girl, maybe 6, no more than that. Her skin was the warm, her eyes, huge, dark and impossibly hopeful, locked onto his with terrifying sincerity. Her tiny hands clutched the frayed strap of a cartoon-themed backpack, the fabric worn so thin it looked like it had seen more life than she had. Before Jonathan could process the question, a woman rushed forward, older, breathless, worry etched into every line of her face. She was black too, mid-60s maybe, short gray curls tucked beneath a knitted beanie, her coat a faded wool number that had braved far too many winters. Her hands trembled as she reached for the girl's shoulders. "Amara," she gasped, her voice low and heavy with exhaustion. "Lord have mercy, child, you can't just run off like that." Her eyes flicked to Jonathan, wide with embarrassment, ready for confrontation. "I'm so sorry, sir," the woman, Lucille, he would learn later, said quickly, pulling the girl gently back. She's got a big imagination, always saying things." But the little girl didn't budge. She planted her feet, chin tilted, eyes still locked onto Jonathan like the whole world depended on his answer. "I meant it," she declared, voice small but unwavering. "Tomorrow's Daddy Day at school. Everyone's bringing their daddies. I don't got one, but I thought maybe you could help." Her words stumbled a little on the edges, but her determination was solid steel. For the first time in years, Jonathan Reed forgot entirely about the time, the line, the meeting downtown with the investment board. Forgotten was the water, the receipt, the scowls behind him. There was something about the way this child looked at him, without fear, without filter, like somehow, even in her tiny world, she saw something in him worth asking for. Lucille's hands tightened on Amara's shoulders, her expression flickering between apology and something far heavier. Resignation, maybe, or the deep, bone-weary knowledge of how hard this city could be. "We're so sorry," she repeated, trying to guide Amara toward the door. "We'll go, we—" Jonathan's voice cut through the air, quiet but firm. "Wait." They both froze. The store, the line, even the humming fridge unit seemed to pause. Jonathan's gaze settled on Lucille, calm but unyielding. "Your granddaughter?" he asked. The older woman nodded hesitantly. "Amara Grace," she offered. Her grip softened slightly. We're not asking for anything, sir. Please don't think that. She just misses what she never had." Jonathan's eyes drifted back to the little girl. Samara stood steady, small, impossibly hopeful, defying every wall he'd carefully built around himself. His throat tightened unexpectedly. He thought of polished boardrooms with glass walls that reflected nothing but his own empty image, of expensive apartments that echoed with silence, of the photo he never took down, the one of his late wife and his little boy, with the same stubborn eyes, lost in the space of a single shattering morning. Jonathan cleared his throat, his voice lower now, controlled but softer. "What happened to her, father?" Lucille hesitated. Her weathered hands fidgeted with Amara's hoodie. "Car accident," she said simply. "Took both her parents when she was just 2. She doesn't remember him." Jonathan nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Behind him, the line grumbled again, but he didn't care. His carefully curated life, built on timelines and transactions, had never prepared him for this, a tiny, fearless voice asking for something no amount of money could buy. He exhaled, steady, deliberate. "Tomorrow," he said at last, meeting Lucille's wary gaze. "What time is Daddy Day?" Lucille blinked, startled. 10 a.m. "But you don't have to—" "I'll be there," he interrupted simply. Amara's eyes widened, her whole face lighting up like Christmas morning had arrived early. "Really?" she whispered, small hand gripping the strap of her backpack like it held all her dreams. Jonathan nodded once, sharp and certain. "But just for one day," he added, the edges of something dangerously close to a smile curling at the corners of his mouth. Amara beamed, the kind of smile that cracked right through concrete. Lucille stood frozen, too stunned to speak, as Jonathan Reed, the coldest man on Wall Street, turned, adjusted his cuff, and walked out the store. He didn't leave with still water that morning. He left with something much heavier, a promise he never saw coming. 8 hours. The morning air hung heavy over Harlem, thick with the smell of asphalt, old brick, and the faint sweetness of roasted nuts from a vendor cart parked down the block. The city always buzzed, horns, footsteps, snippets of sharp conversation, but here, outside the squat, red-brick elementary school, there was a different hum entirely. Laughter spilled across the sidewalk in high gleeful bursts. Clusters of parents stood in small groups, their jackets zipped up tight against the stubborn chill, cradling coffee cups, straightening tiny backpacks, adjusting scarves and hats on their children with the absent-minded tenderness of routine. A painted sign over the double doors read, "Welcome to Daddy Day," in crooked, cheerful letters, the marker ink bleeding slightly from the morning fog. The playground behind the chain-link fence pulsed with chaotic energy, children darting across the cracked blacktop, their bright coats flashing like little beacons, the shrill trill of the recess whistle cutting through the air now and then. Jonathan Reed stood near the curb, hands in the pockets of his dark wool coat, feeling utterly, entirely out of place. He had traded his usual sharp armored suit for something softer. Navy slacks, a crisp blue sweater, leather shoes polished to a quiet shine, but still he looked like a man who had wandered onto the wrong movie set. The other men? Fathers in faded jeans, worn Carhartt jackets, sneakers scuffed from playground runs. They belonged here. They knelt to tie tiny shoes, hoisted kids onto their shoulders, ruffled curls and braids with the ease of familiarity. Jonathan, by contrast, stood still, every movement calculated, his posture straight, his expression unreadable behind carefully controlled features. But his eyes, they drifted, searching, waiting. Then he saw her. Amara Grace, barreling down the cracked sidewalk like a shot of sunlight on two legs. Her pink hoodie was a little brighter today, the sleeves still too long, bunched at her wrists. Her curls were pulled back into two uneven puffs, held by neon scrunchies that clashed delightfully with the faded blue of her backpack. She saw him before he saw her fully. Her tiny face lit up like Christmas morning, and she ran, full sped, no hesitation, weaving between adults with the confidence of a child who had already decided. The world couldn't possibly say no to her. "Daddy?" she called, her voice slicing through the morning noise, clear and certain. Heads turned, conversations paused. A few of the parents, especially the older ones, followed her gaze, their expressions flickering with quiet confusion as they took in Jonathan. Tall, sharply dressed, white. Then back to Amara, small, beaming, undeniably black. Jonathan's jaw tightened for the briefest moment, old instincts kicking in. But then Amara skidded to a stop right in front of him, her tiny fists clutching the fabric of his coat like it was the only thing anchoring her to the earth. Her smile stretched wide, missing a front tooth, her eyes shining with so much joy it made his carefully constructed defenses wobble. He crouched slightly, clearing his throat as if shaking off the sudden weight pressing on his chest. "You ready for this, troublemaker?" he asked quietly, arching one brow in the practiced, controlled way he used on board members when they thought they could surprise him. But there was no edge to it now, only something warmer, unfamiliar, unsettling in the best way. Amara grinned, rocking on her heels. "I've been ready since forever," she declared. "Come on, they said bring our daddies inside." Her small hand slipped into his without waiting for permission, and Jonathan let her lead him, the warmth of her fingers surprisingly steady in his palm. They stepped through the front doors together, and the building swallowed them into a different world entirely. The hallway smelled of crayons, floor wax, and faintly of cafeteria pizza. Bright posters lined the walls. "Kindness counts. Reading is cool." A lopsided construction paper collage of Martin Luther King Jr. and children's artwork adorned every spare inch of corkboard. Laughter echoed down the corridor, blending with the clatter of tiny sneakers and the soft, exhausted voices of teachers ushering groups toward classrooms. As they approached Amara's room, Jonathan caught the looks again. Curious, lingering glances from other adults, some puzzled, some faintly judgmental. A few smiled politely, but most watched, processing. He could practically hear the quiet math in their heads, the mismatched skin tones, the expensive watch on his wrist, the faint Wall Street sheen that clung to him no matter how dressed down he appeared. He wasn't supposed to be here, not in this hallway, not holding the hand of a little girl who didn't look like him, in a neighborhood that wasn't his, surrounded by families that understood struggle in a way he never had to. But Amara didn't care. She pulled him forward with determined little steps, her voice bouncing with excitement as they reached the classroom door. Inside, it was chaos, the kind that only happens when 26-year-olds are hopped up on juice boxes and the novelty of their parents invading their world. There were craft tables littered with glitter glue and construction paper, a makeshift photo booth in the corner where kids posed with oversized fake mustaches and superhero capes. Paper crowns and stickers littered every surface, and at the center of it all, a hand-painted sign above the chalkboard read, "Daddy and Me Day." Jonathan hesitated at the threshold for a heartbeat too long, his polished shoes hovering over the worn linoleum, but Amara tugged him firmly inside. Her classmates barely noticed them at first, too busy building Play-Doh castles and squabbling over who got the blue glitter marker. Then Amara spoke, her voice high and proud. "This is my daddy," she announced, turning to face the room, her little hand still wrapped securely in his. "Just for today." Silence rippled across the room like a small contained shockwave. A few parents looked up. A teacher, young, mid-30s, with curly brown hair and a welcoming smile that faltered ever so slightly, stepped forward. Her name tag read, "Mrs. Bailey." She blinked at Jonathan, momentarily thrown off by the declaration, but recovered quickly, reaching out a hand. "Mr. Reed?" she asked, her voice warm, her eyes still darting with questions she clearly bit back. Jonathan shook her hand, his grip steady, his expression neutral but polite. "Just for today," he confirmed evenly, echoing Amara's words like a quiet contract. Miss Bailey nodded, visibly relieved, ushering them further into the room. The next hour passed in a blur of awkwardness and quiet revelation. Jonathan fumbled with safety scissors, his large hands clumsy next to Amara's tiny determined fingers as they cut shapes for a paper crown. She giggled relentlessly as he tried, and failed, to properly apply glitter glue without coating his sleeves. The other dads eyed him cautiously, a few recognizing his face from financial news segments, whispering among themselves. But no one dared approach, and Amara, blissfully oblivious to the subtle tension around them, dragged him from station to station, her joy undented, her small body practically vibrating with excitement. At the Play-Doh table, she molded 3 little figures, a tall one with pretend glasses, a tiny one with curls, and an older woman with a bun. "That's us," she whispered to him conspiratorially, as if they were the only 2 people in the room. "Me, you, and Granny." Jonathan stared at the squishy figures, his throat tightening unexpectedly. The clumsy Play-Doh man in a suit looked ridiculous, but somehow it was perfect. Later, during story time, Amara climbed into his lap without hesitation, curling against him like it was the most natural thing in the world. She handed him a tattered book titled "My Daddy is a Superhero," her eyes shining with expectation. Jonathan hesitated only a second, then opened the book. His voice, usually reserved for cutting boardroom negotiations, softened, warming each line, as around him the other fathers read aloud, and the quiet hum of belonging finally settled, tentative but real. The cafe wasn't much, tucked between a pawn shop and a discount beauty supply store, but it was warm inside, and that was enough for now. The windows were fogged from the breath of the room, the air heavy with the scent of burnt coffee, old floor polish, and the sugary edge of stale pastries. The tables were scratched, the chairs wobbled if you leaned wrong, but nobody seemed to care. It wasn't the kind of place you stayed for the food. It was where people came to rest, to catch their breath from the weight the city never stopped pressing down on them. Jonathan Reed sat by the window, his coat draped over the chair beside him, his fingers curled around a chipped ceramic mug that steamed faintly. Across from him sat Lucille, her expression unreadable, her hands wrapped tight around her own cup, as if it was the only thing steadying her in that moment. Her coat was still zipped halfway, worn wool faded from too many winters, the edges frayed at the sleeves. Her hair, a cloud of silver curls tucked beneath a navy-knit hat, framed a face lined with years, but her dark eyes were sharp as glass, watching him like she expected him to break. Amara sat between them on the bench, her small legs swinging beneath the table, her pink hoodie sleeves bunched at her wrists, her curls wild around her face. She hummed to herself quietly, stirring her hot chocolate with careful precision, unaware of the tension coiled in the space above her head. The silence stretched, long and taut, filled with everything neither of them wanted to say first. Lucille was the one to break it, her voice low, her words carrying the weight of a woman who'd had to guard what little she had left. "You didn't have to come this morning," she said simply, not as a thank you, not as an accusation, just a fact. A lot of folks say things to kids to shut 'em up. You showed up. Jonathan's eyes drifted to Amara. Her small face glowed with the kind of hope that was dangerous if you weren't careful with it. He cleared his throat, the words unfamiliar in his mouth. "I told her I would," he replied, quiet but steady. "I don't say things I don't mean." Lucille's gaze narrowed, not unkind but sharp, protective, the way only a grandmother who's buried too many dreams can look at a man like him. "You from around here?" The words weren't curiosity, they were a test. Jonathan shook his head slightly. "Downtown," he answered, and it sounded as foreign here as it felt. "Midtown offices, uptown apartment. I'm not from this neighborhood." Lucille snorted faintly, her lips twitching like she'd expected as much. "Figured," she muttered, her fingers tightening on the cup before she leaned in slightly, her voice dropping low, steady as stone. So, why are you here, Mr. Reed? Why walk into that school like you belong in her life? What is it you're really looking for? The air in the cafe pressed in, heavy, humming faintly with the noise of coffee grinders and soft conversation. Jonathan could have lied, could have dressed it up in charity talk or polite half-truths that went down easy. But there was no boardroom here, no strategy. Just a grandmother, a little girl, and the quiet ache that had followed him like a shadow for far too long. My wife's name was Elise, he started, and the words cracked just slightly at the edges. His eyes stayed steady, but there was something raw beneath the surface now, old and sharp. Our son was named James. He had my eyes, and her laugh. He paused, the memory hitting him harder than he expected. 3 years ago, I missed his school project, volcanoes. Papier-mâché, glitter, the whole thing. I promised him I'd be there next time, but I had meetings, numbers to chase, deadlines. His jaw flexed. His knuckles whitened around the mug. Elise took him alone. Drunk driver ran a red light 3 blocks from our apartment. For a moment, even the hum of the cafe faded, replaced by the dull, familiar roar of grief pressing behind his ribs. Lucille didn't speak. She didn't need to. The lines around her eyes softened just slightly, understanding threaded into every careful breath she took. She had the look of someone who knew loss, who carried it like an old scar no amount of time could fade. I built walls after that, Jonathan admitted, his voice low, stripped bare of the polish he usually wore like armor. Work. Empty apartments, days that bled into nights, no people, no promises. His gaze drifted to Amara again, watching as she traced shapes into the condensation on the window with her finger. And then she asked me, just for a day, he exhaled, steadying himself. And I didn't. I couldn't say no. Lucille's eyes stayed on him, weighing his words, her posture straight but her hands loosening on the cup. She don't remember her daddy? She said softly, and even the strength in her voice couldn't hide the ache buried beneath. She was too little, but that don't mean she don't feel him missing. Kids, they feel those empty spaces more than we like to admit. Her gaze drifted to Amara, lingering with the quiet tenderness of a woman who's carried a child through grief and hunger and long sleepless nights. She feels it every day, school, bedtime, walking past playgrounds, holding no one's hand. Jonathan nodded, the weight of those words sinking deep into his chest. I'm not here to replace him, he said finally, the quiet steel returning to his tone, not defensive but steady, certain. I'm not here to play hero. I just thought maybe I could help her not feel that empty space so heavy, even if it's just for a little while. Lucille's gaze softened, but it didn't falter. You can't come and go easy, Mr. Reed, she warned gently, her voice rough with the edge of truth. Not with her. She'll take to you fast. Kids like her, they've learned to cling tight to anyone who shows up. 'Cause not many stick around. Her words hovered there, quiet and sharp as broken glass. Jonathan didn't flinch. His fingers loosened around the mug, his shoulders square, not with arrogance but with something quieter, harder earned. I know what it's like to lose a child, he said, his voice steady, the cracks showing in all the right places. And I won't walk away from that again. For the first time, Lucille leaned back, her posture easing just a fraction. Not trust. Trust was a thing earned slow, but something that looked a lot like cautious hope flickered in her eyes. Amara, oblivious to the quiet storm passing between them, turned from the window, her curls bouncing, her small smile wide and sure. Can we get a cookie, Granny? She asked brightly. Lucille chuckled under her breath, shaking her head. Maybe later, baby. Jonathan's lips twitched into something close to a smile as Amara's attention bounced between them. The heaviness still lingered, the past pressed in like fog outside the glass. But for the first time in 3 years, Jonathan Reed didn't feel like he was suffocating beneath it. Not entirely. The late afternoon sun hung low over the elementary schoolyard, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement and chain-link fence. The street outside hummed with life. Car horns, the faint wail of sirens somewhere distant, the steady beat of a city that never quieted. But inside the school's small, gated playground, a different kind of noise stirred. Children laughed and shouted, darting between faded jungle gyms and plastic slides, their bright jackets flashing like streaks of color against the gray city backdrop. Parents stood along the fence line or clustered in small groups by the steps, sipping coffee from to-go cups, their conversations low and easy, casual in the way only familiarity allows. But Jonathan Reed wasn't casual. He stood still, tall, his shoulders squared beneath the clean lines of his dark coat, hands tucked neatly into his pockets as his eyes tracked Amara across the playground. She balanced carefully along the edge of the curb, arms out, curls bouncing with every step, her laughter sharp and clear above the rest. He should have felt out of place, and maybe part of him still did. The other parents had that worn city edge to them, the scuffed boots, faded jackets, the tired look that came from too many hours worked and not enough hours slept. But they belonged here, in this neighborhood, in this crowd. And him? He belonged in glass offices with polished floors and spreadsheets stacked higher than most people's rent checks, yet here he was, watching over a little girl he'd met only days ago like it was the most natural thing in the world. His gaze drifted across the yard, tracing the faces. Fathers crouched beside daughters, mothers adjusting scarves, grandparents leaning on canes, and then a shift. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to slice through the afternoon haze. A murmur rolled through the cluster of parents near the gate, eyes turning, conversation faltering, as a man approached from the sidewalk. Jonathan noticed him before anyone else. The man was dressed too neat for this block. Creased slacks, dark wool coat, stiff posture that screamed entitlement more than comfort. His skin was dark, his face lined with the faintest trace of arrogance, his expression the kind of practiced disdain Jonathan had seen too many times in boardrooms. He moved with purpose, straight toward the playground, his eyes scanning until they locked onto Amara, then onto Jonathan. Something settled cold and heavy in Jonathan's gut. He didn't need an introduction to know this man wasn't here for casual conversation. The man's steps slowed as he reached the fence, his hands sliding into his coat pockets, eyes flicking over Jonathan with cool precision before landing briefly on Amara. "Cute kid," he remarked, his voice smooth, low, but carrying the bite of something sharper beneath the surface. Jonathan straightened subtly, his chin lifting, his stance quiet but immovable. "Can I help you?" The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Name's Marcus Ellis," he replied, pulling out a slim leather wallet and flashing a business card across the fence. "I'm family, on her daddy's side." Jonathan's gaze didn't waver, though his jaw tensed faintly. The card gleamed beneath the winter sun. Law firm logo, embossed letters. Ellis and Marks, attorney at law. Jonathan tucked the name away like ammunition. "She doesn't know you," Jonathan stated flatly, the weight of the playground noise dulling around them as the tension coiled tighter. Marcus shrugged, slipping the card back into his pocket. "That's not her fault. Wasn't much reason to be around, until now." His eyes narrowed just slightly, the faintest sneer curling his lip. "But I hear someone's been playing house with my niece. Thought I'd see that for myself." Jonathan's fingers flexed in his pockets, his pulse steady but his mind racing. "She asked me to be here," he replied, every word measured. "And I don't answer to you." The other parents were watching now, quiet, uncertain, some shifting uneasily. A few exchanged looks that held more history than words could explain. It wasn't just about the man at the fence, it was about what he represented. Old grudges, family fractures, unseen battles over belonging, and maybe, Jonathan realized, something else entirely. Something sharper. Marcus's gaze hardened, his smile fading like smoke. "You think this is a game?" His voice dipped barely above a whisper, but laced with venom. "You don't know this neighborhood. You don't know her family. You don't know what it means to stay." Jonathan's eyes narrowed, the polished, practiced stillness of years spent at negotiation tables settling over his frame like armor. "I know enough," he replied evenly, his voice low, steady. I know she deserves someone who shows up." Marcus scoffed softly, straightening, his expression cool but laced with quiet warning. "You're not family," he said simply, like a verdict handed down. "And you won't be." His gaze swept the playground once more, lingering on Amara, then flicking back to Jonathan. "This isn't over," he added, turning with the sharpness of a man used to doors opening for him, not slamming shut. Jonathan watched him disappear down the sidewalk, the faint tremor of anger simmering beneath his ribs, not hot, but controlled, cold, steady. The other parents whispered, the tension lingering in the air like static. But when Amara came skipping back across the pavement, her small hand slipping into his, her smile wide, unburdened, Jonathan exhaled slowly, his fingers tightened gently around hers, his gaze lingering on the corner where Marcus had vanished. "What's wrong?" Amara asked, tilting her head up, her eyes round, curious. Jonathan forced a faint smile, the edges tight. "Nothing you need to worry about," he replied softly, his voice quiet but carrying the quiet steel of a promise buried beneath. "Not while I'm here." And as the playground swallowed them back into its noisy, chaotic rhythm, Jonathan Reed stood steady, his grip firm, his heart prepared for the first time in years to fight for something worth keeping. The night had settled over Harlem like a soft wool blanket, heavy with the promise of snow that hadn't yet fallen. The sidewalks glistened faintly under the streetlights, patches of ice creeping along the curbs, the city quieter now, subdued beneath the weight of winter and the hour. On the rooftop garden of Jonathan Reed's building, the city looked different, smaller, quieter, stripped of its hard edges. The lights stretched out in every direction, glittering dots scattered across the darkness, and for once, they didn't look cold. Marara's eyes lit up the moment she stepped onto the rooftop, her small hand tightening around Jonathan's as she took in the twinkling lights, the cupcakes neatly arranged beside the plates, the simple place settings etched with their names in neat black script. Her curls bounced as she all but skipped toward the table, her worn sneakers squeaking faintly on the stone. "This is the best dinner ever," she declared, her voice carrying high into the winter air, cutting through the hum of the city like a song. Jonathan's lips curved into a quiet smile, small but real, as he helped pull out her chair, his fingers brushing against the silver chain at his wrist, the only piece of jewelry he'd worn in years, a quiet reminder of what was gone, and what he wasn't willing to lose again. Lucille stood by the railing for a moment, her eyes scanning the city, the hard lines of her face softened by the golden glow of the lights. She didn't say much at first, just watched them, her gaze lingering on Jonathan longer than it used to, the old suspicion not entirely gone but dulled now, replaced by something quieter, more complicated. He met her eyes for a second, and though neither of them spoke, something passed between them, a recognition maybe of where they'd started and how far they'd stumbled to get here. As they settled at the table, Amara bounced in her seat, pulling out a folded piece of paper from her small backpack. Her grin stretched wide as she slid it across the table toward Jonathan. "Open it," she urged, her fingers tapping the paper with barely contained excitement. Jonathan unfolded it carefully, his eyes tracing the crayon lines, the uneven handwriting, the 3 stick figures beneath a bright yellow sun, one tall, one medium, one tiny, all smiling. Above them, in bold, colorful letters, it read, "Me, Granny, and my Daddy." The paper trembled faintly in his hand, his grip tightening ever so slightly as a sharp ache pressed against his chest, heavy and unfamiliar in all the ways that mattered. He didn't speak right away. His throat tightened, his jaw locking as the edges of the drawing blurred for just a second. Across the table, Lucille watched, her expression unreadable, but her eyes, they softened. They saw it, the way the cracks in him had finally split wide enough to let something real through. "She made that after school," Lucille said quietly, her voice low, steady, carrying the weight of understanding in every word. "Said it was for you." Jonathan swallowed hard, the paper still trembling faintly between his fingers. He looked down at Amara, her small face beaming with pride, utterly unaware of the storm churning behind his calm facade. A silence stretched between them. Not awkward, not heavy, but sacred, wrapped in the fragile, terrifying possibility of what this could mean. Slowly, Jonathan set the paper down, his hands trembling faintly as they folded together on the table. Lucille didn't speak right away. She didn't offer pity or empty words. Instead, her hand, rough, weathered from years of work, reached across the table, resting gently over his. "You missed that moment," she said softly, her voice steady but filled with something deeper than judgment. "But you don't have to miss this one." Her eyes held his, sharp, unwavering. "She don't need perfect. She needs present." Jonathan blinked, the burn behind his eyes raw and unfamiliar. He wasn't used to being seen, truly seen, and not turned away. A small hand pressed gently against his cheek, pulling him back to the moment. Amara had climbed onto her seat, leaning toward him, her tiny palm warm against his face. "If you were a bad daddy before," she whispered, her voice small but certain in a way that made his chest ache, "maybe now you can be a good one. For me." His heart cracked, splintering wide and unguarded in the cold rooftop air. He reached for her, his arms wrapping tight around her small frame, holding her as if she was the only thing keeping him anchored to the earth. "I don't deserve you," he choked, his voice raw, breaking apart at the edges. Amara's small arms circled his neck, her words no louder than a breath. "But I picked you anyway." Across the table, Lucille watched them, her hand still resting on Jonathan's, her eyes shining faintly beneath the soft glow of the string lights. For the first time, she didn't look like she was waiting for him to disappear. She looked like she believed he might actually stay. And for the first time, so did he. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.